Well, the debate and conflict that we've seen growing in these past couple weeks in the Acts of the Apostles has kind of come to a breaking point. We hear about how the debate is rising up about what does it mean to really be a Christian? Are we supposed to hold on to these things from the Jewish tradition, or are we meant to break from it? And the question comes to a climax today in our first reading with the Council of Jerusalem. And so Paul and Barnabas decide that we have to go back to the apostles and to get their input, their insight into what we are supposed to do, and to consult them for their authority and their help and their support. So we hear that they go back to Jerusalem. And the two major questions that come up in this council are, how are Gentiles supposed to come to faith in Christ? How are they to be saved? And what is our relationship to the Jewish tradition? Are we meant to hold on to everything from our Jewish tradition? And we see that conflict kind of summed up in this question about circumcision, which was seen as a promise in the Old Testament, a sign of God's covenant with his people. So they gather together and they discuss, and we hear that there's no shortage of debate and dissension and discord. And it might seem like, what's the big deal? But I think we can draw a parallel in what we are seeing right now happening with the pandemic and the discussion about, do we open or do we not reopen? What is the relationship, or how are we supposed to live in this new reality? Masks or no masks? Are we supposed to socially distance or not? Should we go back to just the way things were, or are we called to live a little bit differently? And so we see this huge, no short amount of dissension and debate happening right now in our world today over this question, in which lives are at stake. Now, how much more would that have been the case in our first reading today from the Acts of the Apostles, when eternal salvation is at stake? When they're trying to figure out, what do we hold on to from our past, and what do we do differently now in our future? How are we called to live differently? But I think we can learn a great lesson from how the apostles gather. This Council of Jerusalem is going to be the first of many councils that are going to happen throughout the church. So not only are they settling this one debate, they're giving a framework for how any sort of conflict should take place in the future. We're going to see this play out again, for example, in the Council of Constantinople and Nicaea, where we get the Creed. We're going to see it even as recently as the Second Vatican Council. And like all councils that will come after it, there's history leading up to it. It doesn't just fall from the sky, but it arises out of this pastoral need. So what can we take away from today's Council of Jerusalem that we're going to hear again at the end of it, the declaration on Friday? We can take away the fact that, look at how they gathered together and they realize that they can't make this important decision on their own. They can't be maverick about what they do. Paul doesn't say, well, I don't care what everyone thinks, I'm just going to go ahead and do what I'm doing. He submits to the wisdom of the church. He says, I don't know everything there is to know, and the church can help me figure this out and decide. And notice that they also gather together in a spirit of prayer. They hear what everyone has to say, everyone says what they want to say, but they're united in prayer. How much could our world learn if leaders from around the world discussed all the possible outcomes, listened to each other, and then prayed? Imagine what could happen. But how are we called in our own lives, in our own times, as we encounter conflict, whether that's in our own families or whether that's in our friend groups, wherever we find ourselves today? How can we learn from the apostles in Jerusalem today? And first listening and praying to figure out what God desires of us today.